It was a Tuesday evening in February, and Karoline Leavitt was doing what she did most nights after work. She sat on her old couch in a tiny apartment in Washington, D.C., eating leftover Chinese food from a paper container. Her laptop was open, on her legs, and she was scrolling through job websites while the news played in the background. At 24 years old, Karoline thought her life would look different by now. When she first moved to the nation's capital 3 years ago, she had big dreams. She wanted to make a difference. She wanted to change the world. But now, as she looked around her small apartment with its cracked walls and noisy neighbors, she wondered if she had made a huge mistake. Her current job was at a small political consulting company. Every day she wrote press releases that nobody seemed to read. She answered phones and scheduled meetings for people who barely knew her name. The work that once excited her during college now felt empty and pointless. She felt like she was just going through the motions day after day. Back in college, Karoline had been different. She was the girl who stayed up all night preparing for debate tournaments. She was the one who organized student rallies and believed that young people could change everything. Her professors told her she had a gift for communication. Her friends said she would become someone important someday. But now, sitting in this tiny apartment, those dreams felt like they belonged to someone else. The worst part was the money, or rather, the lack of it. Her entry-level salary barely covered rent, groceries, and student loan payments. While her college friends were buying cars and taking vacations, Karoline was counting pennies at the grocery store. She had to choose between buying coffee or taking the bus to work. Sometimes she walked 40 minutes to save the bus fare. Her parents back in New Hampshire called every week, asking how things were going. She always told them everything was fine, but it wasn't. She missed home. She missed her mom's cooking and her dad's terrible jokes. She missed knowing everyone in town and feeling like she belonged somewhere. In Washington, she felt invisible, like just another face in the crowd of thousands of young people chasing political dreams. Her college friends had moved on to different paths. Some worked in marketing for big companies. Others had joined tech firms or gone to law school. They posted pictures on social media of nice dinners and weekend trips. Meanwhile, Karoline was eating ramen noodles and watching Netflix on her laptop because she couldn't afford cable. The job search had become a nightly ritual. She would open her laptop after dinner and scroll through dozens of job postings: customer service representative, administrative assistant, social media coordinator. None of them excited her, but they all paid more than her current job. She had even started looking at positions back in New Hampshire. Maybe it was time to admit that the Washington dream wasn't working out. Her boss at the consulting firm was a middle-aged man who seemed to have given up on his own dreams years ago. He spent most of his time complaining about clients and counting down the days until retirement. The office was small and cramped with fluorescent lights that gave everyone headaches. There were only 6 employees and they all seemed as unmotivated as she felt. The work itself was mind-numbing. She would receive a list of talking points from clients and turn them into press releases. Most of these releases were about boring topics like zoning changes or budget meetings. Nobody from the media ever called to ask questions. She wasn't even sure if anyone read what she wrote. It felt like throwing messages in bottles into an empty ocean. During lunch breaks, she would walk around the Capitol building and watch tourists taking pictures. They all looked so excited to be there, so hopeful about American democracy. She remembered feeling that way once. When she first arrived in Washington, she would take the same walking tours, imagining herself working in important government buildings someday. Now those buildings just reminded her of how far she was from her goals. Her apartment was in a run-down building 20 minutes from downtown. The elevator was always broken, so she had to climb 4 flights of stairs every day. Her neighbors were mostly other young professionals in similar situations, all struggling to make it in an expensive city on entry-level salaries. They would nod politely in the hallway, but rarely spoke to each other. Everyone seemed too tired or stressed to make friends. The loneliness was perhaps the hardest part. Back home, she had a tight group of friends and a supportive family. In Washington, she knew her coworkers but wouldn't call them friends. She had tried joining young professional groups and volunteering organizations, but everyone seemed so competitive and fake. People were more interested in networking than building real relationships. On weekends, she would call her college roommate, who was working at a marketing agency in Boston. Her friend would talk about office parties and team-building events, about colleagues who became close friends. Karoline would listen and pretend her own job was equally fulfilling, but she felt increasingly isolated from her old life and unable to build a new one. Her daily routine had become predictable and depressing. Wake up at 7, shower, grab coffee and a muffin from the corner store, take the bus to work, sit at her desk for 8 hours, take the bus home, eat dinner alone, search for jobs, watch TV, go to bed. Repeat. She felt like she was stuck in a loop with no way out. The worst days were when she had to attend political events for work. She would stand in the back of conference rooms, listening to politicians give speeches about hope and change, while she felt hopeless and stuck. She would see other young staffers who seemed confident and connected, and wonder what was wrong with her. Why couldn't she make it work like they had? Her student loans were a constant source of stress. The monthly payments took up almost a quarter of her income. She had called the loan company multiple times to ask about payment plans, but the options were limited. Sometimes she lay awake at night doing math in her head, trying to figure out how she could afford both rent and loan payments the next month. The breaking point came on a particularly bad day at work. Her boss had criticized a press release she had spent hours writing, calling it boring and uninspired. A client had complained about slow response times. The coffee machine was broken, and the office was too hot because the air conditioning wasn't working properly. By the time she got home that evening, she was exhausted and defeated. She sat on her couch with her laptop, seriously considering applications for jobs back in New Hampshire. There was an opening at the local newspaper that paid almost as much as her current job. She could move back in with her parents for a few months to save money. She could start over somewhere familiar and comfortable. Maybe the Washington experiment was over. As she clicked through job websites, she had the TV on for background noise. The evening news was covering preparations for a big congressional speech that was happening later that week. She barely paid attention at first. Political speeches had become routine background noise in her life, but something about this particular event caught her attention. Maybe it was because she had nothing else to focus on, or maybe it was because she was at such a low point that she was open to any kind of inspiration. She realized she would probably watch the speech, not because she expected anything special, but because it was something to do on another lonely Tuesday night in Washington. She had no idea that this decision would change everything. 3 days later, Karoline found herself in the same spot on her couch, but this time she wasn't job hunting. She had decided to watch President Trump's address to Congress, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because she had nothing better to do, or maybe some small part of her still hoped that politics could inspire her again. She had picked up dinner from the Chinese restaurant downstairs, the same orange chicken and fried rice she ordered every week because it was cheap and filling. Her laptop was closed beside her for once. She had made a deal with herself to stop looking at job postings for one evening and just watch the speech, without any distractions. The coverage started at 8 o'clock. She watched as reporters discussed what the president might say and what it could mean for the country. Normally, this kind of political analysis bored her to tears. She had heard it all before, but tonight felt different somehow. Maybe because she was at such a low point in her own life that she was ready to listen to anything that might give her direction. As the cameras showed members of Congress filing into the House chamber, Karoline found herself actually paying attention. She recognized some of the faces from her work, though she had never met any of these people personally. They all looked so important and confident, everything she felt she wasn't. She wondered what it would be like to be in that room, to be part of something that big and meaningful. When President Trump walked into the chamber, the applause was thunderous. Karoline had seen him speak before on television, but something about this moment felt more significant. Maybe it was the setting, or maybe it was her own state of mind, but she found herself leaning forward on her couch, actually interested in what he was going to say. The speech started with the usual political topics: the economy, foreign policy, various legislative priorities. Karoline listened, but her mind kept wandering back to her own problems. Her rent was due in 2 weeks, and she wasn't sure she could make the full payment. Her student loan company had called twice that week. She needed to make a decision about her future soon. But then something changed. About 20 minutes into the speech, President Trump shifted his tone. He started talking about young Americans who were struggling to find their place in the world. He spoke about people who had come to Washington with big dreams, only to find that the reality was much harder than they had imagined. Karoline's attention snapped back to the television. It was as if the president was speaking directly to her situation. He talked about young people working long hours for little pay, believing in their country but feeling forgotten by the system. He mentioned recent college graduates who were drowning in debt while trying to build careers in public service. Her heart started beating faster. This wasn't the usual political talk she was used to hearing. This felt personal and real. She put down her container of Chinese food and focused, completely on the screen. For the first time in months, a political speech was holding her complete attention. The president continued, talking about how easy it would be for young Americans to give up on their dreams. He acknowledged that many of them were considering leaving Washington, leaving politics, leaving public service entirely. He said he understood why they felt discouraged, why they questioned whether their work mattered. Karoline felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She had been thinking exactly those thoughts for weeks. She had been ready to give up on everything she had once believed in. Hearing her own struggles reflected in a presidential speech was overwhelming in a way she hadn't expected. Then President Trump told a story that changed everything for her. He spoke about a young woman from a small town who had left everything behind to work in Washington. This woman had believed she could make a difference, but after months of low-paying work and constant rejection, she was ready to go home. She felt like a failure, like she had wasted her time and her family's money on an impossible dream. Karoline's breath caught in her throat. The story was so similar to her own experience that it felt like the president had somehow looked into her life. The young woman in the story was from a small town, just like her. She had moved to Washington with high hopes. Just like her. She was struggling financially and emotionally, just like her. But then the president continued the story. He explained how this young woman had realized that her struggles weren't a sign of failure, but a sign that she was fighting for something important. He said that the easy path would have been to stay home and never try at all. The fact that she was struggling meant she was pushing herself beyond her comfort zone, trying to achieve something meaningful. The tears were flowing freely now. Karoline grabbed tissues from the box on her coffee table, but she couldn't stop crying. She wasn't sad exactly. She was feeling something she hadn't felt in months. Hope, maybe. Or recognition. Or just the relief of hearing someone acknowledge how hard it was to be young and idealistic in a world that often seemed to crush those qualities. President Trump's voice grew stronger as he talked about the importance of young voices in American politics. He said that the country needed people who hadn't given up yet, people who still believed that government could work for ordinary citizens. He emphasized that real change always came from people who were willing to sacrifice comfort and security for their beliefs. The applause in the chamber was constant now, but Karoline barely heard it. She was completely absorbed in the president's words. He was talking about courage, about the courage it took to stay in the fight when everything seemed hopeless. He said that the young Americans who were struggling right now would be the ones to save the country's future. As the camera panned across the audience, Karoline saw other young staffers and interns in the gallery. Some of them were crying too. She realized she wasn't alone in her struggles. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of young people in Washington going through the same challenges she was facing. They were all trying to balance their ideals with the reality of bills and student loans and uncertain futures. The president talked about perseverance, about how the most important victories came after the darkest moments. He said that giving up was always an option, but that the people who changed history were the ones who kept going when everyone else quit. He urged young Americans not to let temporary setbacks destroy their long-term dreams. Karoline was sobbing now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition and relief and something that felt like awakening. She had been so focused on her daily struggles that she had lost sight of why she came to Washington in the first place. She had wanted to be part of something, bigger than herself, to contribute to the democratic process, to help make the country better. The speech was building to its conclusion, but the president had one more thing to say that hit Karoline like lightning. He looked directly into the camera and spoke about young Americans who were watching at home, wondering if they should give up on their political dreams. He told them that their country needed them now more than ever. He said that their struggles were preparing them for the leadership roles they would take on in the future. As the speech ended and the chamber erupted in applause, Karoline sat in stunned silence on her couch. Her Chinese food was cold and forgotten. Her tissues were scattered around her. But for the first time in months, she felt something that had been missing from her life. She felt purpose. She wasn't sure what she was going to do differently, but she knew something fundamental had changed inside her. The president's words had reminded her of who she used to be and who she still could become. The struggles she had been going through weren't proof that she was failing. They were proof that she was trying to do something difficult and important. The television coverage switched to political analysis. Karoline turned off the TV. She didn't want to hear pundits breaking down the speech and analyzing its political implications. She wanted to sit with the feeling she had right now, this sense of renewed purpose and possibility. She looked around her small apartment with different eyes. It wasn't a symbol of her failure anymore. It was the place where a young woman was learning how to fight for her dreams. The cramped space and cracked walls were just temporary obstacles, not permanent limitations. For the first time in weeks, Karoline felt excited about tomorrow. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do, but she knew she wasn't going to give up. The president's speech had reminded her that her struggles were part of a larger story, and that story wasn't over yet. In fact, it might just be beginning. Karoline barely slept that night. She kept replaying the president's words in her mind, especially the story about the young woman who almost gave up on her dreams. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear his voice talking about courage and perseverance. By 4 a.m, she was wide awake, sitting by her window and watching the sun come up over Washington, D.C. The city looked different to her now. The same buildings that had felt cold and unwelcoming just yesterday now seemed full of possibility. She could see the Capitol dome in the distance, and instead of feeling intimidated by it, she felt drawn to it. Something inside her had shifted, completely, and she knew there was no going back to the way things were before. When her alarm went off at 7, she was already dressed and ready for work. Her co-workers immediately noticed something different about her. She walked into the office with more energy than she had shown in months. Her boss, who was used to seeing her drag herself to her desk every morning, actually commented on how alert she looked. But Karoline could barely focus on her usual tasks. Writing press releases about local zoning meetings felt even more meaningless than before, but not because she was depressed. Now it felt meaningless because she knew she was meant for something bigger. The president's speech had awakened something in her that made her current job feel like a waste of her talents. During her lunch break, she did something she had never done before. Instead of eating at her desk like usual, she walked to the nearest Trump campaign office. She had looked up the address that morning and printed out directions. Her heart was pounding as she approached the building, but she forced herself to keep walking. The campaign office was busy and chaotic. Young people rushed around with clipboards and phones, looking important and purposeful. This was exactly the kind of energy Karoline had been missing in her life. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching everyone work, and felt a surge of excitement she hadn't experienced in years. A volunteer coordinator noticed her standing there and asked if she needed help. Karoline's voice shook a little as she explained that she wanted to volunteer. She told him about her background in communications and her experience writing press releases. The coordinator's eyes lit up when he heard about her skills. Within 15 minutes, Karoline was filling out volunteer forms and learning about upcoming campaign events. The coordinator explained that they desperately needed help with writing and social media. They had more work than they could handle, and not enough experienced people to do it. Karoline felt like she had found exactly where she belonged. That evening, she called her parents for the first time in 2 weeks. Her mother answered on the second ring, and Karoline could hear the concern in her voice. She had been worried about her daughter's long silences and short conversations. But tonight, Caroline's voice was different. It was excited and hopeful in a way her mother hadn't heard since college. Karoline tried to explain what had happened to her during the president's speech. She told her parents about the story that had moved her to tears and how it had made her realize she couldn't give up on her dreams. Her father, who had always been practical about money and career choices, listened quietly as his daughter talked about volunteering for a political campaign. Her mother was the first to speak when Karoline finished explaining her decision. She said she could hear the happiness in her daughter's voice for the first time in months. Even though she was worried about the financial risks, she could tell that something important had changed in Karoline's life. Her father agreed, saying that he would rather see his daughter struggling while chasing her dreams than giving up on them entirely. The conversation lasted over an hour, much longer than their recent calls. Karoline felt like she was talking to her parents as an adult for the first time, sharing her real thoughts and feelings instead of just trying to reassure them that everything was fine. They ended the call with her parents promising to support whatever decision she made about her future. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Karoline would go to her regular job during the day, but her mind was completely focused on the campaign work she would do in the evenings. She started staying at the campaign office until 10 or 11 at night, writing content and helping with events. The other volunteers quickly recognized her talent and dedication. Her regular job became almost unbearable. She would sit at her desk, writing boring press releases while thinking about the exciting projects waiting for her at the campaign office. Her boss noticed that her work was becoming sloppy and distracted. He called her into his office twice that week to ask what was wrong with her performance. Karoline wanted to tell him the truth, but she knew he wouldn't understand. How could she explain that a political speech had completely changed her perspective on life? How could she describe the feeling of finally finding work that felt meaningful and important? Instead, she apologized and promised to do better, all while planning her exit strategy. The breaking point came on Friday afternoon. Her boss assigned her to write a press release about new parking regulations for a small-town client. As she stared at the computer screen, trying to make parking meters sound interesting, she realized she couldn't pretend anymore. She was wasting her life doing work that didn't matter when she could be contributing to something historic. She saved her work, cleaned out her desk, and walked into her boss's office. Her resignation letter was simple and professional. She gave 2 weeks' notice and thanked him for the opportunity to learn. Her boss was shocked, asking what job she was leaving for and whether he could match the salary. When she told him she was going to volunteer for a political campaign, he looked at her like she had lost her mind. Her co-workers had similar reactions. They couldn't understand why she would leave a steady paycheck to work for free. One of them pulled her aside and asked if she was having some kind of mental breakdown. Another suggested she take a vacation before making such a big decision. But their concerns only made Karoline more confident that she was doing the right thing. The weekend, after she gave her notice, was the first time in months that she felt truly excited about Monday morning. She spent Saturday at the campaign office learning about upcoming events and meeting other volunteers. Many of them were young professionals like her who had left stable jobs to be part of something they believed in. She realized she wasn't crazy for making this choice. She was joining a community of people who shared her values and passion. On Sunday, she called her college roommate to share the news. Her friend was worried about the financial implications but admitted that Karoline sounded happier than she had in years. They talked about their college days when they used to stay up all night discussing politics and planning how they would change the world. Her friend said it sounded like Karoline was finally becoming the person she was meant to be. That Sunday evening, Karoline sat in her apartment and looked at her budget one more time. She had enough savings to cover rent and basic expenses for about 2 months if she was careful. After that, she would need to find a paying job within the campaign or figure out another solution. It was scary to have so little financial security, but it was also liberating to know she was finally following her heart. She spent the evening organizing her small apartment and throwing out things she didn't need. It felt symbolic, like she was clearing space in her life for new opportunities. She packed up the job search materials she had been collecting for weeks and put them in storage. She wouldn't need them anymore because she was finally on the right path. As she got ready for bed that night, Karoline felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. She was about to start the most uncertain period of her professional life, but she had never been more confident about a decision. The president's speech had reminded her who she really was underneath all the doubt and fear. She was someone who believed in fighting for her country and her principles, even when the odds seemed impossible. Her last 2 weeks at the consulting firm flew by. She finished her projects and trained her replacement, but her heart was already somewhere else. Every evening, she would rush to the campaign office to work on writing projects and event planning. The other volunteers started calling her by name and asking for her opinions on important decisions. She felt valued and respected in a way she never had at her old job. On her last day of work, her boss wished her luck and said he hoped she knew what she was doing. Karoline thanked him sincerely, but she couldn't help smiling as she walked out of the office for the final time. She did know what she was doing, maybe for the first time in her adult life. She was choosing courage over comfort, purpose over security, and dreams over fear. Karoline's first week as a full-time volunteer was unlike anything she had ever experienced. She arrived at the campaign office at 7 in the morning and often didn't leave until midnight. The work was demanding and fast-paced, but she felt more alive than she had in years. Every task felt important, every deadline felt urgent, and every success felt personal. Her main job was writing content for social media and press releases, but she quickly found herself taking on additional responsibilities. The campaign staff noticed her attention to detail and her ability to work under pressure. Within days, they were asking her to help with speech writing and communication strategy. She felt like she was finally using all the skills she had developed in college and her previous jobs. The other volunteers became like a second family to her. They were all young people who had made similar sacrifices to be part of the campaign. Some had left corporate jobs, others had dropped out of graduate school, and a few had moved across the country with nothing but their savings and their belief in the cause. They understood each other in a way that her old co-workers never had. Late nights at the campaign office became some of the best times of Karoline's life. She and the other volunteers would order pizza and work together on projects, sharing stories about their backgrounds and their hopes for the future. These weren't just colleagues, they were people who shared her passion for politics and her willingness to take risks for their beliefs. After 3 weeks of volunteer work, something unexpected happened. The communications director for the campaign called Karoline into his office for a private meeting. She had been working directly with him on several writing projects, and he had been impressed with her work. He told her that they had an opening for a paid position on the communications team and wanted to offer her the job. Karoline could barely believe what she was hearing. The salary wasn't huge, but it was enough to cover her basic expenses and even pay down some of her student loans. More importantly, it was a real job doing exactly the kind of work she had always dreamed of. She accepted the offer immediately, feeling like all of her sacrifices had been worth it. Her parents were thrilled when she called to share the news. Her mother cried happy tears over the phone, saying she had been praying for something like this to happen. Her father, who had been quietly worried about her financial situation, admitted that he was proud of her for taking such a big risk. They both said they could hear the joy in her voice and knew she had made the right choice. The paid position came with new challenges and responsibilities. Karoline was now working directly with senior campaign staff and helping to shape the messaging for major events and announcements. She found herself in meetings with people she had only seen on television before. The learning curve was steep, but she thrived under the pressure. One of her biggest projects was helping to organize a major campaign rally in her home state of New Hampshire. She was responsible for coordinating with local media and writing materials for the event. The rally was going to be huge, with thousands of people expected to attend. Karoline had never worked on anything so large and important before. The week leading up to the rally was intense. Karoline worked 18-hour days, coordinating details and managing last-minute changes. She barely slept and lived on coffee and energy bars, but she had never felt more focused or motivated. This was exactly the kind of high-stakes political work she had always wanted to do. The night before the rally, Karoline couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about how much her life had changed since that evening when she watched the president's speech on her couch. Just a few months ago, she had been ready to give up on politics entirely. Now she was helping to organize one of the biggest political events in her home state. The rally itself was everything she had hoped it would be. Thousands of people filled the venue, all excited and energetic about the campaign. Karoline stood backstage, watching the crowd and feeling overwhelmed by the scale of what she was helping to create. When President Trump took the stage, the crowd erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. As she listened to the president speak, Karoline thought about that young woman he had mentioned in his congressional speech, the one who had almost given up on her dreams in Washington. She realized that woman could have been her, but instead of giving up, she had found the courage to change her entire life's direction. After the rally, several senior campaign officials complimented Karoline on her work. The communications director told her that her organizational skills and attention to detail had been crucial to the event's success. For the first time in her professional life, she felt truly valued and appreciated for her contributions. The success of the rally led to even more opportunities. Karoline was promoted within the communications team and given responsibility for managing media relations in several key states. She found herself traveling regularly, coordinating with local campaign offices and building relationships with reporters and political operatives across the country. Her old co-workers from the consulting firm reached out occasionally, asking how her experiment with campaign work was going. They were shocked to learn that she had not only found a paying job, but was advancing quickly within the organization. Some admitted they were jealous of her career trajectory and the exciting work she was doing. As the campaign intensified, Karoline's responsibilities continued to grow. She was now writing talking points for major speeches and helping to develop communication strategies for important policy announcements. Senior staff members relied on her judgment and frequently asked for her input on critical decisions. Long hours and high pressure sometimes exhausted her, but Karoline had never been happier with her career. Every day brought new challenges and opportunities to learn. She was working alongside some of the most talented political professionals in the country and learning skills that would serve her for the rest of her career. 6 months after joining the campaign as a volunteer, Karoline received another unexpected phone call. This time it was from someone at the White House personnel office. They had heard about her work on the campaign and wanted to discuss opportunities for her to join the administration after the election. The conversation was surreal for Karoline. Just a year ago, she had been eating Chinese takeout in her tiny apartment, seriously considering giving up on politics entirely. Now, people at the White House were calling to recruit her for government positions. The transformation seemed almost impossible to believe. As Election Day approached, Karoline reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought about that night when President Trump's speech had moved her to tears and changed her entire perspective on her life and career. She realized that sometimes the most important moments come when we least expect them, when we're at our lowest points and most ready to give up. When the election results came in and Trump won, Karoline joined the celebration at campaign headquarters. She was surrounded by the volunteers and staff members who had become her closest friends, all of them crying and hugging and celebrating together. They had worked incredibly hard for this moment, and seeing their efforts pay off was overwhelming. The White House job offer became official 2 weeks after the election. Karoline was invited to join the communications team in a senior role, with responsibilities that went far beyond anything she had imagined when she first started volunteering. The salary was more than double what she had made at her old consulting job, and the opportunity to serve in the White House was beyond her wildest dreams. When she accepted the position, Karoline thought about calling her old boss to share the news, but decided against it. She didn't need his validation anymore. She had proven to herself that taking risks and following her passion had been the right choice, even when everyone around her thought she was making a mistake. Her parents drove down from New Hampshire for her first day at the White House. They took pictures of her walking through the gates and standing in front of the building where she would be working. Her mother kept saying she couldn't believe her little girl was going to work for the President of the United States. On her first morning in the White House, Karoline sat at her new desk and thought about that crying young woman on the couch, just months earlier. That person felt like a stranger now. The struggles and doubts that had once seemed so overwhelming now felt like necessary preparation for the challenges she was ready to face. At 27 years old, Karoline was named White House Press Secretary, making her the youngest person ever to hold the position. As she prepared for her first press briefing, she carried with her the memory of that transformative night when a president's words had reminded her that young Americans have the power to shape their country's future. Standing at the podium for the first time, looking out at the room full of reporters, Karoline felt the same sense of purpose that had filled her heart during that congressional speech. She had learned that the most important thing in life wasn't avoiding failure or playing it safe. It was having the courage to pursue your dreams even when the path seemed impossible.